Gendered and racial discrimination is very much so alive and well in the West, and it near exclusively affects white men. A point that will hardly come as much of a surprise to the majority of you, though the sheer scope and scale of it might, as there are some fascinating bullet points from this article we're going to look at today, that comes from the perspective of somebody inside the industry at the moment when DEI hit the hardest. A very fascinating piece which we'll get to, but first, to illustrate the scope and scale. In the film and TV writing rooms of 2011, 48% of the people there were white men. By 2024, that was down to 11.9%. An absolute unmitigated slaughter. In new media outlets, The Atlantic went from a staff of 53% male and 89% white in 2013 to 36% male and 66% white in 2024, with post-2020 hirings amounting to 78% people of colour. Not even just merely majoritively at that point, but overwhelmingly so. In academia, it's no different, with Yale having one white millennial on the tenure list compared to 16 others. In internships, LA Times, 2020 to 2024, 7.7% white men. And in studios like Disney/Sundance, there isn't even enough white men to make up a statistically measurable portion. 0% around about. This, of course, came after a long and systemic process of eradicating white men from these fields, and many others as well. And we're going to have a look at this article now, because very amusingly, it comes from the perspective of somebody trying to get into it, and more often than not, trying to do so from a left-wing perspective as well, and it has several interesting little tidbits. It may be hard to remember now, but a decade ago, the prevailing critique of American journalism was that it was woefully lacking in gender and racial diversity. And that is indeed true. Back in 2011, 2012, 13, 14, the primary critique of gaming, of movies, of entertainment was basically the white old men running everything. And you might wonder why this critique was even allowed. Why was this obviously racial and gendered critique something that people could just say out loud in the open with no consequence? Well, it was because they were the ones determining culture now, the people saying it. And you've got to remember, there was a genuine feeling of optimism back then, as he comes to continue to describe. There had been a hope that new media would be different, that the internet might bring in a wider range of voices, and why wouldn't it? Of course, when all you need to have to start uploading articles or making videos is an internet connection, surely that would be the most democratizing force of all, and we would finally see the diverse voices rising to the fore. But by the mid-2010s, that optimism was waning. New media ventures like Vox, BuzzFeed, and Politico are trying to shake up the way people get their news and entertainment online, NPR reported, all of whom failed, by the way. But critics say those newsrooms and leadership roles are overwhelmingly made up of white men. The critics were mostly right. Gawker was still 57% male and 79% white. Weiss was majority male and 70% white. At 5:38, Nate Silver complained about a gender gap so severe that only 15% of applicants were women. Now, this too is simply just the way of things. We talked about this a while ago in another article complaining that the majority of successful podcast hosts were white males. The simple fact appears to be that that particular demographic are more willing to embrace risk and throw themselves into new areas like podcasting, for example, to try and see if it's viable to make a living over there. This is a gendered role, practically, and it's something that we seemingly cannot change. No matter how we try to socially engineer society, there will never be a situation in which men are more interested in becoming nurses than doctors, and vice versa. It was into this world that Andrew arrived in 2015. He took a job at a prominent new media organization and was put on general assignment. And he also was, amusingly enough, a left-winger. I had credibility as somebody who had come from a more left-leaning perspective, was very well sourced on the left, but was willing to give them a kick in the teeth every now and then. At the time, it felt really about holding power to account and giving new ideas a fair airing. This is interesting because, very much so, the idea of the left to begin with was to unseat the old white men who had clamped down on everything unfairly so and refused diversity to bubble up to the fore to its natural forefront and position in media and entertainment. This was a part of our generally optimistic view of the future. Back then, it was presumed that everything would always get better, more boisterous, richer, better, faster. Everything would improve: technology, morals, society, etc. And so obviously, the things that ailed the old world, the evil white men, would also eventually be displaced, right? That was what it was considered to be left-wing at the time, but that didn't happen. After college, before he'd moved into journalism, Andrew had worked in non-profit world. Ambient talk about diversity and power structures had been part of the general atmosphere, and he'd never much thought about it. In any progressive space, there was always at least some concern about representation, he explained. I don't see that in any way impeding my advancement for the first 6 or 7 years of my career, because of course the left-winger does not believe that he himself will be affected by it. It is the oligarchs that will be affected. It's the old white men doing this unfairly that will be affected. But that view became harder to sustain in 2019. David Haskell, who had just been named editor-in-chief for New York Magazine, was asked to respond to staff disappointment that another white man had been elevated to the role. I understand the reaction, part of me shares it, he told his staff. The most efficient way to move the needle on diversity hiring is for a strong, loud commitment to come from the very top of the masthead. I plan to do that exactly. As then, of course, the progressives began to be elected into leadership positions. They were now the old white men, and the very first thing they did upon reaching that position was to reach down and pull the ladder up behind them as swiftly and effectively as possible. Andrew didn't work at the New York Times, but he watched similar pressures reshape his newsroom. So he has lots of achievements, he goes here, and institutions pursuing diversity decided there would be no backsliding. If a position was vacated by a woman or person of color, their expectation was it would be filled by another woman or person of color. The hope was always that you were going to hire a diverse candidate. And of course, by 2019, that had already largely happened. See, the idea of gender and racial equality, as nonsensical as it is to try and socially manufacture society in this way, well, it was largely achieved like 6 years ago. But this was never about representation, as we've harped on about repeatedly. It was always about power. Then George Floyd hammered that point home. Newsrooms tripped over themselves to stage a reckoning. The New York Times solemnly promised sweeping reforms on top of the sweeping reforms it had already promised. The Washington Post declared it would become the most diverse and inclusive newsroom in the country. CNN pledged sustained commitment to race coverage, while Bon Appetit confessed that our masthead had been far too white for far too long, and the magazine had tokenized many BIPOC staffers and contributors. NPR went further still, declaring that diversity was nothing less than its North Star. Everyone doubled down on the double down. These weren't empty slogans either. In 2021, new hires at Condé Nast were just 25% male and 49% white. At California Times, parent company the Los Angeles Times San Diego Union Tribune, there were just 39% male and 31% white. That year, ProPublica hired 66% women, 58% people of color. At NPR, 78% of new hires were people of color. For a typical job, we'd get a couple hundred applicants, probably at least 80 from white guys. The hiring editor recalled, "It was a given that we weren't going to hire the best person. It was jarring how we would talk about excluding white guys." The pipeline hadn't changed much. White men were still nearly half the applicants, but they were now filling close to 10% of open positions, as this, of course, was the inevitable conclusion to all of this. If you have 100 jobs to fill, a company isn't going to include or raise that to 200 to meet diversity quotas. What they're going to do is exclude a group from those hirings. And if you are furthermore in a position where the majority of the applicants are white men, as they often are in jobs like journalism, for example, where a large majority of people who try simply never succeed, it requires a lot of risk-taking spirit to try and join a field like that. They simply decided to exclude them. And we know this is true because they told us. We've all seen Disney's hiring practices, where they go, "We don't want white men." We have seen BBC declare openly that they have intern position for diverse people only. We have literal "whites need not apply" posters in public, created by otherwise presumably reputable organizations. Suddenly, in Andrew's newsroom, everything was driven by identity. There were endless diversity trainings, a racial climate assessment, and at one point reporters were told they had to catalogue in minute detail the identity characteristics of all their sources. Andrew had been instrumental in forming the union at his company and objected when negotiations shifted from severance pay and parental leave to demand for racial quotas. They wanted to do like emergency hires of black people. And Andrew himself is, of course, the problem here. Andrew came in from the left. Andrew further made his employment furthermore left. He created a union with left-wing ideals, and then he suddenly turned around and went, "Why am I on the right now? How am I the outcast now?" Because, Andrew, you were always the useful idiot in this equation. When you were told years ago that race should matter more than qualification, you should have realized that this again was never about representation. And again, this is what happened when they became majoritively diverse. It didn't quiet down. Nobody simply says, "Oh, well, we've hit our goals." It became more strident. When he questioned these new priorities, the response was swift. On a Zoom call, women would clap back at something I was saying, and other women would snap their fingers in the chat window. He recalled it was this whole subcultural language being introduced wholesale. Yes, the left has outpaced you. This has now become their means of communication. This is the woman going, "No, no, no, white man, stop speaking. We have the power here because you have given it to us, and we mean to replace you." And they were never secretive about it either. Desperate for advancement, he had had the same job, the same title for nearly 6 years. Andrew looked elsewhere. I applied for positions at The Atlantic, Politico, CNN, The Washington Post, 3 different desks at The New York Times, he told me, but newsrooms were contracting, which only made the competition more intense. When scarcity set in, you start to worry about these things a little bit more, Andrew reflected. This was a business model problem that was exacerbated by the racial and gender preference problem. No. This was not a business model problem, Andrew. This was a you problem, a leftism problem. As these branches of media grew more diverse, they grew less profitable. Gaming media is a perfect example of this. There was a time at which gaming media journalists were considered virtual saints among the audience they were serving. They were not only trusted, they were our sole source of news. They They were us. We loved them, and we believed they loved us. They had a captive audience they could have kept for decades onwards, but they decided that their politics were more important. The same for newsrooms. All of these newspapers, media outlets could simply have chosen to remain news outlets, but they chose to be political. This was not business, this was ideology. At The Atlantic, Andrew didn't even get an interview. Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief, had described his hiring philosophy back in 2019 by opening up the possibilities of younger people, women, and people of color by imagining their rise in a deliberate way. I've just widened the pool of potential leadership. There's no quota system here. Goldberg was candid about another less comfortable reality. It's really hard to write a 10,000-word cover story, he said in that same interview. There are not a lot of journalists in America who can do it. The journalists in America who do it are almost exclusively white males. With or without quotas, The Atlantic succeeded in hiring fewer of these white males. Since 2020, nearly 2/3 of The Atlantic's hires have been women, along with 50% people of color. In 2024, The Atlantic announced that 3/4 of editorial hires in the past year had been women and 69% people of color. Yet again, you have the person saying, yes, the majority of the qualified individuals are white male. However, we elected to not hire any of them because of our ideology. The irony was, where older white men remained in charge, especially where they remained in charge, there was almost no room to move up. Of course, Andrew, you simply believed that you would become the new old man. But they were already there, they're already in the system, and they're holding up the ladder, they're pulling it up after themselves. And you are the victim of your own ideology. At the very bottom of the ladder, the picture is a little different. Since 2020, only 7.7% of Los Angeles Times interns have been white men. Between 2018 and 2024, of the roughly 30 summer interns each year at the Washington Post, just 2 or 3 were white men. In 2025, coincident with certain political shifts, the Post internal class had 7 white guys, numbers not seen since way back in 2014. By the early 2020s, many journalists I spoke to noted something else. The young white men who once flooded internship and fellowship pools had simply stopped applying. Gen Z men had absorbed the message that journalism was not for them. The femaleness is striking. A well-known Gen X reporter with impeccable liberal bona fides confided, it's like, wow, where have the guys gone? They're not there. They're not wanted. They got the message that you weren't going to hire them. No matter how good they got, no matter how well they wrote, they were the wrong race, as you told them. And they moved on, because they needed to continue living. In less than a decade, the entire face of the industry had changed. The New York Times newsroom had gone from 57% male and 78% white to 46% male and 66% white in 2024. Newsroom were center-left places in 2005. Prominent Gen X reporters told me now they're incredibly left places. I imagine one reason newsrooms have gotten more explicitly left is that you have white guys and white women adopting a kind of protective coloration, allyship mindset to get through the door, as there also remains, of course, one of the only ways to get hired. Okay, if left-wingism and your race is the primary hiring criteria, your best bet is to adopt the language. It is to sing from the hymn sheet of diversity and representation, because that will appeal to the people now holding your paycheck hostage. Andrew, for his part, was unable to adopt the performative allyship that had become expected. I always thought I was an effeminate nerd growing up, but my way of expressing myself now puts me on the most masculine end of men in media, he told me. I started to pick up on the fact there wasn't much room for people who even spoke in my timbre. If you are a white man, you've got to be a superstar, Andrew told me. You can't help feeling like no matter how good you are, you were born in the wrong year. No, you were born in the wrong race and gender. Again, what is fascinating to me about this is that both this example and the next examples as well, none of them ever seem to turn around and realize what happened here and why this became reality. They simply seem to think as if this, again, was something that had just happened accidentally, some force of nature that came in and changed all of this, even whilst having seen it happen at first glance, even whilst having been a part of the change in their own right. They are still looking over and going, well, how did I end up on the right? And this, of course, is also true in other fields as well. We're going to skip some of them because these are fucking massive, but I want to touch upon this one, which says peak television. So it has a part here. A whistleblower sent me a document from early 2017, an internal needs sheet compiled by a major talent agency that shows just how steep the headwinds were. So this comes from the perspective of somebody who had a fair bit of success writing television episodes, who was on the verge of breaking into this medium. Compiled by major challenges across the grid, which tracks staffing needs for TV writers, room staffing, the same shorthand appears dozens of times. Diverse, female, women and diverse only. These mandates came from some of the most powerful names in television: Noah Hawley prioritizing women, Dean Devlin prioritizing women, ideally higher ethnic African American, Ryan Murphy want female and diverse emphasis on African American. This was systemic discrimination documented in writing, implemented without consequences. It is striking how casual it all was. Chicago Fire, the UL upper level, can be anyone, but we need diverse staff writers. As in other industries, upper-level positions, writers with experience and credits could still be filled by white men, but the entry-level jobs, the staff writer and co-producer positions that Matt and thousands of other aspiring writers were competing for were reserved for others. Studios had these quotas they felt pressured to fill. A veteran talent manager told me it was always the lower and the mid-level people, because those are the ones that don't matter as much. See, here's this thing as well. When a lot of this started, the argument was made that the best people were also the diverse people. Diversity is our strength, was the argument. If you want better stories told to a wider audience, you needed diverse writers and diverse creatives. The argument became initially that diversity would just appear naturally. It didn't. Then, when they realized that there was only 100 jobs available, the argument then pivoted towards, no, we need these diversity people because it will create a better product. Therefore, we're not actually technically hiring based on race, we're hiring based on merit. But now, a part of merit became racial. And at the time, a lot of these people probably believed it as well, but we've now seen it. The proof and the pudding have both arrived together. Entertainment have only gotten worse. The diverse writers and the diverse producers have failed to produce virtually anything worthy of note. Indeed, the more diverse the show seems to become, the worse the product appears to be, with Disney's The Acolyte being the peak pinnacle example of this now, the Mount Everest of diversity, a show in which Disney gave the left everything they could ever have asked for on every level, and it was their largest flop ever produced. Every fellowship grant and hiring incentive was suddenly oriented towards changing who got in the door. The Writers Guild lists more than a dozen studio-run initiatives for emerging diverse writers. And this was another thing too, of course, the workshops. Back in the day, the workshops were simply held for anyone. Now we have workshops for women in technology, or POCs on social media, etc. And again, this isn't legal. None of this is actually legal. There are anti-discriminatory laws in the US and in the West in general, but they are never applied to this. The only cases in which it has been applied is when individuals go out of their way to sue the companies in question for discriminatory practices. And even then, it's going to be an individual individuals slogging it through the court system for a decade or more to finally get a ruling on it. The Disney writing program, which prides itself on placing nearly all of its fellows as staff writers, had awarded 107 writing fellowships and 17 directing fellowships over the past decade. None to white men. 0%. Nearly every capsule buy of these programs is an attempt to communicate with as little subtlety as possible that the writer is not a white man, a Korean and Polish-American writer from Seattle, a comedy writer with Cuban, Puerto Rican, New Mexican roots. Exactly. Because it is about excluding you. That is a part of this. It is not merely performative, it is ideological. It is a determination made between themselves that you are the enemy, and they are treating you as such. Another prestigious venue for up-and-coming screenwriters was the Sundance Screenwriter Lab, which proudly lists Darren Aronofsky, Paul Thomas Anderson, and Quentin Tarantino amongst its alumni. The lab was just amazing, Quentin Tarantino recalled in 2017 at the 25th anniversary of Reservoir Dogs. They took us really seriously. I couldn't believe how altruistic it was. Their whole point was just to help us to refine our aesthetic. In 2010, Sundance came under fire for producing a disproportionate number of white male authors. The organization decided that would never happen again. In 2016, 2017, 27.5% of applicants to the Screenwriter Lab were white men, but they were just 14.7% of participants. That figure turned out to be relatively high, since in 2018 just 8 of 138, 5.8% of the fellows selected have been white men. Notably, nearly all have either had some other defining characteristic, disabled or gay, or were partnered with a woman or a person of color. Today, just 1 in 10 millennial programmers at Sundance is a straight white man. Again, in a majority white male country. Now, this goes on at quite some length to describe similar examples of this, and I do like as well, I believe it was, what was it here? Oh, there we go. Throughout our conversation, Matt never blamed the women or people of color who'd gotten opportunities he hadn't. He blamed the older generation of white men who pulled up the ladder behind them, and he was right to. In 2004 and 2013, over 40 Gen X white men received Academy Award nominations for screenwriting. In the following decade, 2014-2023, 150 Gen X white men were nominated alongside just 6 white male millennials. And there is absolutely a point there as well. Sure, you are going to enter into a system that benefits you. Are you going to argue that that is the fault of the person benefiting from it, who otherwise had no hand in building it? That would obviously be unreasonable. But this isn't the white men at the top. This is your ideology here. This is political. This presents it as if it was just something that kind of sort of happened, as some power play by a group of individuals. No, this is all political. This is all ideological. They hate you for your race and your gender. And to simply just continue to ignore this speaks of the sheer brainwashing power of the ideology. Even the individuals who have been victimized the most by it refuse to recognize the fact that they have been aggressed upon. They have been the primary victims of an ideology that they themselves, in many cases, championed. And a part of that is obviously going to be the protection of the ego, to remind oneself that you didn't do all of this by yourself, you didn't ruin your own chances solo, and of course they did not. But this was always rather obvious. This was always going to happen. It could never have worked out in any other way. Because in a media defined by quality, which entertainment and media in general is, with so much access to so many sources, to so many alternatives, with YouTube, with Twitter, with everything, it is a more competitive field than ever, and the cream always rises to the top in such extreme competitive circumstances and external meritocracies, when they themselves then, the media organizations, the game developers, the television television producers begin hiring first and foremost based on race and gender rather than qualifications, they will obviously fall behind for the simple reason that the person who would be at the top, who they could have hired, they didn't. And that person now, in many cases, will still have ambitions to work with the thing he is passionate for, and will, instead of being an employee, become the competition. It is unavoidable. And the fact that it is finally now, after 10 plus years, beginning to percolate to the top of the public consciousness is at once incredible and at the other hand also a very, very good thing. It's almost surprising it took this long, and it's also surprising it happened as quickly as it did, considering the absolute chokehold this ideology evidently had over its acolytes. The Lost Generation is a very fitting title here, as is it the Lost Generation? Is it the last Lost Generation? I honestly suspect that the next one might actually fare even worse than this one, because bear in mind now, the generation that pulled up the ladder is now being aged out. The generation who were primarily introduced because of their race and gender are now in power. What are the odds that they will decide to dismantle the system that primarily benefits them? Very small. And Generation Alpha is showing worrying signs of general tech illiteracy, to the point where I do not believe they will be able to seize the promises of the tools being produced right now. I think generative AI will become a false crutch for Generation Alpha far more so than a tool. I believe that if anything, this upcoming generation will be hampered by technology rather than aided by it. And they certainly will not have an easy time entering into the fields that will be dominated by those who earned their positions based on the pigmentation of their skin or the shape of their genitals either. Ride's not over yet, gentlemen, but it's nice to see some light at the end of the tunnel, at least for some of us. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.